Hey guys, so in the tradition of what I used to do with the more audio based reviews and everything, this is going to be another audio review, but it's basically a vlog. And anyway, so I wrote this kind of as I was watching the movie, and in this instance, I'm going to kind of just describe uh, sort of what the experience is like and some of the high points and low points of the unreleased 1993-94 Fantastic Four movie. And I'm basically going to be referring to it as the 1990s Fantastic Four movie. Since it was unreleased, it's kind of hard to really say that this is like a mass audience appeal movie. But as it is, I think you'll be satisfied with what I have to say. Anyway, with a lot of the response to the latest incarnation of the Fantastic Four in cinemas receiving negative press, I felt that it was worth my while, after seeing such mediocre, over-stylized interpretations on screen for the past few years, even with actors I like, I felt it was conclusive that there are some heroes who work on film and some who don't. One of my main objections is that the Fantastic Four series of comic books is usually some rather hard sci-fi and not the usual heroic antics, like trying to solve a mystery, trying to figure out, what the villain is up to, that kind of thing. It's usually much more hard-edged, this energy is causing this person to have this problem. You have a MacGuffin for the story or a character who is acting for a certain purpose. And it's really more just about, we have to stop this person. So you get more of the sort of Guardians of the Galaxy sci-fi approach to the story, where you know exactly what the MacGuffin is, or you aren't quite clear on it, but you basically have people coming after you, trying to stop you, and it's much more with aliens and monsters and that kind of thing. I feel like this is partly why characters like Green Lantern are hard to adapt, because you need the voice of the narrator to make the work into a compelling story for the audience. I'm not sure going in how I'll feel about the 1994 unreleased production that was done in part, in production at least, by Roger Corman. But it was notoriously done for a tiny budget, solely for the purpose of not to be released, so that the copyright holders who had bought the rights from Marvel and lived in Germany or operated out of Germany could keep hold of the film rights. Red Letter Media did a great review of this on Best of the Worst, and they liked it the most out of their selection of superhero movies. So it's a good question of how I'll feel, personally. To start you off, Corman decided to directly rip off of the opening to the first Superman movie. A younger me would have found this cheap, but in the postmodern sense of things, where we've seen plenty of writers and directors rip off of one another in every possible way, I can let this go because Superman was at least a good movie. And they had their own theme. They went with a slightly different route. Instead of just flying through a starscape, they take you through some stock footage of planets. The intro uses basic titles over stock animation of space from the 60s and 70s, and would remind a lot of younger viewers of the opening to Third Rock from the Sun's opening. The music is an excellent opening overture, and you get a lot of the same sense of heroism and mystery as that of Superman. So I really have to praise David and Eric Wurst for their work on this right away, straight out. They're doing a very noble attempt at sort of doing what John Williams does, and he's been doing it for a long time, but back then he was, a rather accomplished composer, and they were able to do what he did, but without it being John Williams, and without it sounding too much like John Williams. Anyway, so you start off the film with George Gaines, the actor who played Punky Brewster's dad and Commandant Lassard in Police Academy, as a physics professor in a white lab coat while teaching a lecture. He does a great job, and I absolutely love it. So look for his performance right away, because it's a brief cameo, and you won't see him again after that, but it's well worth it. Reed Richards is a student in the class who is quick with an answer that Ben Grimm finds a little bit haughty, but Richards isn't cocky about his intelligence. I actually already find the first minute of this movie less annoying than the 2000s version already. One of the MacGuffins for this plot is a mysterious meteorite called Colossus that will pass through an energy field or something and be visible as it slows down the rotation of the Earth. Brad Jones called it a comet, but I would actually call it more of a rogue planet. If it has the mass to cause enough of a gravity well as to slow down the Earth's rotation. However, gravity wells tend to impact the path of orbit, not the object's rotation. Just like the moon being closer in its orbit doesn't impact the length of the Earth's day, it just sort of causes the Earth's tides to shift a little bit. That's the effect of gravity, but doesn't affect the rotation. So Richards and Victor are friends working on the study of Colossus while Richards lives at a boarding house owned by Sue and Johnny Storm's mother. Sue is just a girl, but she's in her early teens, and she has a crush on Reed. So Victor and Reed try to collect some of the information about the rare elements of the meteorite when Victor gets zapped by a bolt of lightning, basically coming from the meteorite, and Ben saves him. So, when they're at the hospital, or actually they're still at the science building, soap opera music that sounds like it was recorded in a normal room as opposed to a sound studio plays as Victor is taken away in a body bag by two medical officials that we saw playing chess earlier as ominous music played over their appearance. And it's soon revealed that they are agents of Victor's home country who will try to save him. 10 years later, Reed and Ben are looking to pilot a rocket into space. I have to mention that Ben's story arc here is really interesting because he starts out as not just a big guy, but he's genuinely sweet and kind, as well as good-looking. So knowing that he will turn into the Thing feels really tragic. Reed actually wonders about letting Johnny and Sue go on the mission as civilians, but given that only a few years earlier Challenger featured civilians before it had a mechanical failure, I could see it working with training. I do find it objectionable that Reed is against the idea until he sees that Sue has grown up into a beautiful woman, not knowing anything else about her. Considering that he was an adult when she was still a child, this could normally be seen as a destined romance, but in the moment itself just looks a little creepy. Realistically, they might only be about 6 years apart, so a relationship isn't that ridiculous, just awkward with someone you've known as a child when you were an adult. The mother dubs them the Fantastic Four at this point, presumably out of pride, but it still seems weird. With respect to the canon of the source material, Johnny Storm was supposed to be a decent pilot as well, serving as a co-pilot to Ben, and Sue was a scientist much like Reed. I kind of wish that more had been made of that, so that then there was more of a purpose for them being on the mission. Johnny is a decent pilot, Sue's a really good scientist, so they can act as assistants on the mission. There's reason there, rather than just, oh, well, we know them and they'd love to go. It's like, no. Anyway, so the last someone made anything out of Sue and Johnny actually being worth taking on the mission, the fact is we got a really hokey movie out of it in the 2005 Fantastic Four movie and the sequel, Rise of the Silver Surfer, which didn't even pan out to anything really. So I really don't know how to feel about the idea of Sue and Johnny actually being made into people worth taking along. So as it is, it's okay, because this film still does a better job. So the scene with them going to collect Sue and Johnny basically ends Act 1, Scene 5, and Scene 6 requires that we follow the formula and reintroduce the intrigue of what happened to Victor by seeing the agents. And then for some reason there's a sort of leprechaun-looking guy poking his head up, saying that he can smell a diamond. Ben bumps into a blind woman named Alicia Masters, with whom he's clearly meant to fall in love. It's cheesy, but it's no worse than other stuff I've seen, especially at that time. And for Marvel, this is actually poetry, considering their usual level of writing. Yes, I am a DC fan, and I don't care. I like some Marvel stuff, but usually they have better writing involved in the Marvel Cinematic Universe than is actually involved in the actual content from the canon. You know, they just have this ongoing soap opera with very schmaltzy writing usually. I actually kind of like that they used the on-set audio for the scene in the stairway that I just referred to, where Ben meets Alicia Masters. They actually used on-set audio rather than post-production dubbing to make the voices a little clearer, because the actors had natural reason to talk as they are as the scene comes to a close. They're talking to each other louder going up the stairs. The rest of the place is quiet, but it has a little bit of ambient noise, so then you don't need Foley artists, which can actually add a bit to the cost of the production. And it also lends some elements of realism that I really appreciate in the storytelling of a superhero sci-fi story. I want a little bit of realism in that. Anyway, re-enter our leprechaun, and he's sort of watching over Alicia and ogling her, and it turns out later that his name is the Jeweler, so although I'm going to refer to him sometimes as the leprechaun, his name is actually the Jeweler. I'll refer to him as the Jeweler later in this review. Anyway, he's quickly dropped again to cut to our Euro stooges for Victor, and it seems that the leprechaun is going after a large uncut diamond that will act as a lens for scanners to process readings from the Colossus meteorite. So it's basically a geode, really, but it just happens to be made of diamond. Reed sets a green laser grid, and Alicia sculpts Ben's face as the leprechaun watches and is like, my beauty, and stuff like that. It's really weird. So the leprechaun is able to get around the laser grid and replaces the diamond with an exact replica, which frankly would actually be more expensive to make than the diamond itself, and would be somewhat rarer, to make an exact duplicate. Anyway, so the diamond wouldn't necessarily do a better job either. The only reason why diamonds themselves are particularly unique is because they're basically a solid molecule, but that doesn't mean that they are necessarily perfect. Structurally, they are known to have certain flaws inside, in the structure, so it would have to be a perfectly flawless diamond of that size, and it would cost, basically infinity dollars to get a large diamond that size uncut that's just roughly hewn. And then, even then, you wouldn't want to put light or energy through it, because then you would have it just bouncing all over the place. You would actually want a more geometrically sound lens, unless you were somehow customizing your sensors to read from the diamond through its material. So it gets a little bit weird at that point, but it's a plot device, and it's basically set up for childhood level understanding. This whole movie was kind of made for kids and people who don't have a real in-depth knowledge of science. It just doesn't quite resonate for a postmodern audience who are exposed a little bit more to facts of science and things via the internet. So anyway, an indeterminate amount of time later, the Richards crew are set to launch their shuttle in non-spacesuits with motorcycle helmets. They seem to have had training, but it's hard to say the civilians know what they're doing. So, as the energy bombards their ship, they discover that the diamond is a fake, and Colossus, I guess, explodes. I don't know. The diamond explodes anyway. We mostly get some abstract footage over the shots of the actors, and it's kind of overexposed a little bit. And then we get a shot of an exploded model as we cut to Dr. Doom in his throne room. Then, shortly after, this sort of ends Act 1, but we cut to the crew on the ground, mysteriously surviving and in no pain. Reed thinks it's odd, naturally, that they've survived while the ship is destroyed. Reed, Johnny, and Sue quickly discover their powers, though, and after a scene with Alicia clearly having been obsessed with Ben, it shows that she requested the head molds of the Richards crew in order to learn his name. Now, apparently the head molds were used to mold the, helmets. So I don't know exactly. But the Leprechaun, it turns out, as I said, is called the Jeweler, and he has an army of crazy homeless people sent to kidnap Alicia. Ben turns into the Thing overnight, just sort of out of the blue, as the crew is located and collected. The costume for the Thing here is really good, with facial articulation of the eyebrows and the lips. Of course, it turns out that they were collected by Latveria, which is Dr. Doom's country that he rules over. So while the Richards crew plot their escape, the Latverians try to obtain the diamond and fail. The spin cut with punching noises for when Reed and crew break out is rather good, as it actually doesn't require fight choreography and is rather family-friendly. Interestingly, there's a plot point around the Latvian language cluing Reed into their being somewhere other than America. The Fantastic Four break out, and Reed quickly tries to discover what has happened to them, and Sue tells Reed that she is shy around him. This makes him think that somehow what happened was to do with inner characteristics breaking the surface, even though such things are mostly metaphorical. So, no pun intended when I say that the idea is a stretch, but it's cute enough that a young audience would understand it, and at the time superhero movies were still thought of as being for kids, even with Tim Burton's Batman franchise. Speaking of which, I find it weird that at this moment, when they're talking about the personality idiosyncrasies coming to the surface as their powers, Johnny makes a joke based on the 60s Batman TV show when he says, "Holy Freud, Batman, I think you're right." It's like you're crossing the streams. You're crossing from Marvel into DC. You've got DC in my Marvel, and that somehow is just, mind-blowing a little bit. So Ben runs off kind of in shame at what has happened to him, and he's found by the minions of the Jeweler and treated nicely for once, since everyone else in New York is kind of running away from him. I think it's interesting that the writers chose to make the Jeweler the initial bad guy for this movie, and to call Victor simply Doom at first instead of Dr. Doom straight away. As Johnny is reminded of Victor, he remembers seeing Latverian on the notes that Victor used to send him in class, and concludes that Victor is alive. This seems like a big conclusion to jump to, but it moves the story along. So, anyway, Victor attacks the Jeweler, and Ben intervenes to save Alicia, saying his famous catchphrase, "It's clobbering time." But, interestingly, when she tells him she loves him, he turns back into himself. As he runs away, he turns back into the Thing. So it actually is an interesting plot point that Ben could actually turn back if he was sort of touched deep down enough that he became soft again, like inside. It plays into that inner characteristic thing that that they actually talk about. So the writing actually holds up in this instance and actually adds an interesting plot element. You know. Anyway, the actor playing Victor decided in his ransom message to act with his hands, but since the mask limits his expressions, this isn't really a bad idea to do. I mean, if you had to act behind a very solid mask that didn't articulate at all, you might be acting with your hands as well. I don't like that the group suddenly has the Fantastic Car without explanation as soon as the ransom message comes forward. And we've never been introduced to this Fantastic Car anywhere. So they take the Fantastic Car to Latveria, but we don't know where they get it from. And that's really a frustrating point for me. They don't mention it at the start, like, oh, you invented that prototype flying car, and that's what's gotten people interested in your work with Colossus. They don't introduce it after they get back. Oh, by the way, I had an idea for a flying car that would make a great transportation. Or, oh, let's steal this flying car from this castle here in Latveria, and then that's their car. You know, they steal it as, like, originally Dr. Doom's prototype flying car or something. You know, that would at least make sense, because then, hey, this is how we made it back to New York so quickly. But I don't recall them using or mentioning the Fantastic Car at all up until that point. So it's really weird. Anyway, Victor traps them in a force field and is going to destroy them with the laser that he uses some of the material from Colossus in, and I think he actually uses the diamond in it originally. Like, that's actually the plan, is he's going to use the diamond to make a giant laser that'll be able to blow up wherever, and it'll give Latveria unlimited power, basically. Although you'd need a lot of power to power a laser back in 1993. Anyway, so he's going to use the laser to destroy New York City from Latveria, which is a little bit of a weird idea considering that Latveria is in Eastern Europe, but we'll just move on. So Reed is able to get his foot out of the force field, and he's able to kick the laser, apparently. Now, this is actually a pretty emblematic scenario for the comic book and the animated series of the Fantastic Four that came out around the same time. The laser is fired to destroy New York, though, and the low-budget CGI effect for the Human Torch goes after it. Bearing in mind the low budget, this is actually not that bad, and I have seen films released with unfinished effects. Star Trek Insurrection and Lost Souls starring Winona Ryder, among others. Someone would say that there is no way a fireball can travel as fast as a laser beam, except that if you know your physics, you know that an object traveling closer to the speed of light gains mass as time slows down for it, and a material object would eventually have infinite mass and have all time stop for it, leading it to it converting into energy. If this is happening to the Human Torch, who is already made of fire, then he would already be made of energy, meaning that he could absolutely travel faster than light on some level, and as long as he could still have oxygen to burn. So as long as he remains in the atmosphere, he's still energy, and he could actually travel faster than light. And you might be asking, how? Well, the fact is that they were able to speed up the speed of light by having it travel through a mass of plasma. And plasma is a state of energy that is basically like fire or lightning. It's basically the point just before the atoms break down and it converts directly into energy. So, I mean, given that, it's kind of a weird concept when you actually think about it, but they've been able to slow down the speed of light, and they've been able to increase the speed of light. And this is a laser beam traveling several, 100 miles, if not thousands of miles, through air around a planet, most likely bouncing off of the ionosphere. So I don't think it's that entirely impossible that that in this realm of of suspension of disbelief and sort of self-delusionment around science, you couldn't also believe that a man made of fire could catch up to a laser beam. Okay? Anyway, so Johnny stops the laser from destroying the Empire State Building, which is actually okay looking and all. But then he flies up into space, which to me doesn't make sense because there's no oxygen. However, if you look on the film as not being made with hard science in mind, as I've already said, then why not? That and flying faster than a laser are kind of written like Superman reversing time by spinning the world the other way. Prior to this film, I had only really known Jay Underwood for his role as the android Chip in the Not Quite Human series of films, and as the boy who could fly in the film of the same name. He actually shows his acting chops as Johnny Storm in this, and I have to say that at 90 minutes, this film is a little short, but does a good job of telling the story. They save a lot of money on sets by only really having a few, and filming the rest on location at very nondescript settings. The music direction and cinematography are pretty good, and I could actually sit down and watch this movie in a theater and not feel ripped off. So I have to stand with Red Letter Media and say that the 90s Fantastic Four movie is worth checking out. It's corny and cheesy, but worth watching for a fun movie. You won't get a lot of substance for your time, but I would rather watch this one than the bigger budget one made in the 2000s. It's a lot more enjoyable and could be watched repeatedly without getting nearly as tired of it. Also, a bonus is the lack of a Stan Lee cameo. The film follows a basic three-act structure, with the first act consisting of Victor's accident and the introduction of the Colossus plot device, and the introduction of the jeweler and Alicia Masters, the diamond. The first act ends with the accident up in space. The second act basically consists of the jeweler and his minions battling Victor's men, while the Fantastic Four are held captive by Victor, and Alicia discovers the man she met was Ben, is distraught by the idea of him dying, and then is captured by the jeweler. The second act ends with the escape from Victor's castle, and the third act basically picks up with the discovery that Victor is still alive. You have a classic contest between Reed and Victor as best friends, and although most postmodern viewers would classify it as a bromance, I'm not above saying that they might have had more tender feelings for one another, because it's perfectly natural for esteemed colleagues who admire one another to feel a sense of devoted love for one another that turns into a life bond. You see this when Reed tries to save Victor. So while I enjoyed this movie, it does lack in some areas. For a movie with a shoestring budget, this film felt like it was bigger budgeted than it was. The music alone makes that worthwhile, but the budget was clearly spent more on the Human Torch effect, and even more so on the costume of the Thing, which was pretty amazing. Your suspension of disbelief is maintained pretty well throughout the film, up to the point that they inexplicably have the Fantasticar. So to wrap this up, I'll give the 90s unreleased Fantastic Four a very appropriate 4 out of 5. It hits all the right notes, but the tune is derivative of other work, so to speak. The cast pull off a good performance, and the overall experience is genuinely enjoyable. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye-bye.